There was a moment in America somewhere between the end of one war and the beginning of another kind of tension, when a single car pulled into driveways across the entire country and just stayed there. Not because it was flashy, not because it was the fastest thing on the road. It stayed because it was right for the times, right for the wallet, right for the family standing at the front door, waiting. That car was the Ford Customline. If you grew up in the 1950s, you didn't just see this car, you lived around it. Your neighbor had one. Your uncle drove one. Your teacher parked one outside the school every single morning. It was everywhere, every color, every driveway, from California to Connecticut and back again. It was the car that built the American suburb as much as any bulldozer or blueprint. And then, just like that, it was gone. By 1957, the Customline name had vanished from every Ford showroom in America. No scandal, no recall, no dramatic collapse in sales figures. It simply disappeared. Quietly retired while the rest of the decade raced toward chrome, tail fins, and pure American excess. Here's what nobody tells you. That disappearance wasn't an accident. It wasn't the market rejecting the car. It was Ford making a cold, calculated decision, a business move that said far more about where America was heading than about anything wrong with the machine itself. And that is exactly what we're going to pull apart today. We're going back to 1952, the year Ford celebrated its 50th anniversary. The year they completely rebuilt their entire lineup from the ground up, and we're walking through every version of the Customline, year by year, right up to the moment it quietly left the showroom floor for the last time. By the time we're done, you'll understand what made this car dominate the sales charts, what it actually cost a working man to drive one off the lot, why Ford was so desperate to beat Chevrolet that they ripped out a legendary engine and replaced it with something entirely new, and why the very qualities that made this car beloved by millions eventually signed its death. Warrant. Pay close attention to that last part, because this isn't just a story about a car. It's a story about America itself, about what people wanted in 1952, what they stopped wanting by 1957, and how that shift changed an entire industry almost overnight. If you've ever wondered why the cars of that era felt more honest, more solid, more real than almost anything that came after, this story might finally give you your answer. We start right here, right now, 1952. But before we go back, there's one thing you need to understand about why this car existed at all, and it starts not in a factory. It starts in the American mind, after years of war and rationing and waiting. That's where the real story begins, and it's more interesting than the brochure ever let on. America in 1952 was a country rebuilding itself in real time. The Second World War had ended 7 years earlier, but the habits it created, rationing, waiting, making do, those habits were only just starting to loosen. Men who had come home from Europe and the Pacific had married, moved into houses that hadn't existed a decade before, and were now staring down the hood of a decade that promised something the previous 20 years had repeatedly failed to deliver: stability. Entire suburbs grew up almost overnight. New schools, new churches, new roads stretching in every direction, connecting one development to the next, and every single one of those driveways needed a car. Here's what most people forget. America in 1952 wasn't fully at peace. The Korean War was still active. There was still a heaviness in the air, not despair, but tension. A quiet hunger for something solid, something reliable, something that said, "We made it, we're going to be fine." Ford read that moment with surgical precision. When they launched their completely redesigned 1952 lineup, timed deliberately to mark Ford's 50th anniversary, they didn't just release new models, they built a system. A deliberate, three-tier architecture designed to sell aspiration in layers. At the bottom sat the main line, functional, no frills, the honest entry point for a buyer who needed a car and nothing more. At the top sat the crest line, more chrome, better interior, the car you bought when you wanted your neighbors to notice. And right in the middle, carrying the weight of the entire lineup, sat the Customline. This is where Ford's thinking gets genuinely interesting. The middle tier is where companies make their real money, Not the luxury model that only a few can afford, not the base model with its thin margins. The middle. That's where the broadest group of buyers live. People with enough ambition to want better than basic, and enough sense to avoid overpaying for a name. The Customline gave you chrome window trim, two-tone interior options, better seat fabric, and a choice between two-door, four-door, and station wagon body styles. It looked like a serious car. It sat well in a driveway. It didn't embarrass anyone in the company car park on a Monday morning. A 1952 Customline four-door sedan listed at around $1,850. That's roughly $20,000 in today's money. Not cheap, not extravagant. Real. But there was something mechanical under that hood already showing its age. An engine that had served Ford loyally since 1932, beloved, proven, and quietly becoming obsolete. That engine was the flathead V8, and its days were numbered. But before we talk about what replaced it, there's a battle you need to understand. Because by 1954, Ford and Chevrolet were no longer just competing, they were at war. The flathead V8 was already a legend by the time it powered the first Customlines off the assembly line in 1952. Ford had introduced the flathead V8 back in 1932, a decision that changed American motoring permanently. Before Ford made it available in a low-priced car, a V8 engine was something you found in expensive, elite machines. Ford made it common, made it accessible, made it democratic in a way that no other manufacturer had managed at that price point. For 20 years, that engine had powered everything from police interceptors to family sedans. It was, in the truest sense, the engine of American life. But by the early 1950s, the flathead was feeling its age. Overhead valve designs coming from Oldsmobile and Cadillac were producing more power with better efficiency. The flathead was putting out around 100 horsepower in its final configurations. That was decent. It wasn't exceptional, and Ford knew it. Meanwhile, across the showroom floor, literally across the street, in many American towns, Chevrolet was preparing something that would force Ford's hand completely. In 1955, Chevrolet launched their small block V8, efficient, lightweight, and genuinely exciting to drive. The Automotive press called the new Chevrolet the hot one. Chevy had taken a car that many buyers considered the safe, conservative choice and turned it into something that made people feel something when they turned the key. But Ford hadn't waited to be caught flat-footed. In 1954, one full year before Chevy's famous small block Ford dropped a new engine into the Customline, the overhead valve Y-Block V8. Named for the distinctive shape of its engine block, it displaced 239 cubic inches and produced 130 horsepower. That was a meaningful jump over the old flathead, and it made the car feel genuinely different on the road. For a buyer sitting in a Ford dealership in 1954, here's what that meant in practical terms. For roughly $1,900, approximately $21,000 in today's money, you could drive home a mid-size family sedan with a modern, competitive V8 under the hood. Not a racing car, not a hot rod, but not a sluggish machine either. Ford was making a statement, and the sales figures backed it up. In 1952, Ford outsold Chevrolet for the first time in years. Then, Chevy pushed back. Then, Ford surged again. Back and forth through the middle of the decade, two giants trading blows through chrome grills and cubic inches, with every working family in America watching from their driveways. The Customline was Ford's frontline soldier in that war. But a war like this one carries a cost. And that cost was about to show up in the styling studios in ways that would change the Customline and eventually end it far sooner than anyone buying one in 1954 could have imagined. The design arms race was coming, and it would consume everything in its path. By 1955, something had shifted in American culture that had very little to do with engines. America was prosperous, more prosperous than it had been at almost any point in its history. The GI Bill had put millions of men through college. New highways were stitching the country together at a scale previously unimaginable. Television had arrived in living rooms from Boston to Los Angeles, and it was doing something subtle and powerful. It was showing people not just what was happening in the world, but what other people had, what they drove, how they lived, what they aspired to be. And what people were seeing in those images in Life magazine, on television, parked outside neighbors' houses, was a new kind of car. A car that didn't just move you from one place to another. A car that made a statement. Longer lines, larger chrome bumpers, two-tone paint combinations that would have seemed almost frivolous 3 years earlier, wrap-around windshields. And by 1957, in cars from other manufacturers, genuine tail fins reaching upward, like something drawn by a man who'd seen too many science fiction films. Ford responded, they had to. The 1955 Customline was notably sharper than the 1952 original. The upper glassed section of the car was redesigned. The hood line was lower. The body side trim was more elaborate. The two-tone paint options multiplied. You could order your Customline in color combinations that would have seemed outlandish just 3 years earlier. The 1956 model took it further. A redesigned grille, a new dashboard layout, more chrome along the flanks. The car was visually creeping closer to the top-tier Fairlane, which had arrived for 1955 as Ford's new prestige nameplate, than it was to the plainly functional mainline beneath it. On the surface, that sounds like progress, more style, better presence, the same solid structure underneath. But something important was happening beneath all that chrome. With every added styling feature, the Customline was becoming harder to position clearly. Its identity was blurring. The price gap between it and the Fairlane was narrowing. The visual gap was narrowing. Ford was inadvertently undermining the clarity of the very system they had built in 1952. And they knew it. The decision was already being made. Before we get to what that decision was and how it meant the permanent end of the Customline name, I want to pause here for a moment. If you're finding value in this kind of history, the real story behind these machines, the decisions that shaped an era, then subscribe to this channel right now. This is built for people who want more than a press release. Leave a comment below telling me the first car from this era that you remember clearly, a Customline, a Bel Air, anything from the 1950s. And if you have a friend who would appreciate this kind of content, share it with him. It costs nothing, and it matters enormously. Now back to Ford's problem. Because what happened next is the chapter most automotive histories skip entirely, and it's the most revealing part of the whole story. Here's the part that almost nobody tells you, and it should be told. The Ford Customline didn't disappear because it failed. It didn't disappear because buyers rejected it, or because a mechanical flaw destroyed its reputation, or because some internal scandal forced the company's hand. None of that happened. The Customline disappeared because Ford made a cold, deliberate decision in the executive offices of Dearborn, Michigan. A decision that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with identity. By 1956, the American car market had become something fundamentally different from what it had been in 1952. In 1952, buyers wanted substance, reliability, honest value, a car that worked and lasted and didn't make them feel foolish for buying it. By 1956, they still wanted all of that, but they wanted it wrapped in personality, in story, in a name that meant something beyond a position on a price chart. Mainline, Customline, Crestline. Those names described a product structure. They told you where you stood in the hierarchy, but they didn't tell you who you were. They didn't speak to anything beyond function and price. Ford looked at what Chevrolet was doing with the Bel Air name, a name that evoked California sunshine, open roads, a very specific kind of American dream, and understood that the game had changed entirely. People weren't just buying transportation anymore. They were buying a version of themselves. For 1957, Ford restructured its entire passenger car lineup. Out went the three-tier system that had served them since the 50th anniversary launch. In came a new architecture built around names with emotional weight. The Custom 300, the Fairlane 500. The Customline's position in the hierarchy was filled by the Custom and the Custom 300. Same basic engineering mission. Same mid-size family sedan. Different name. Different story. But here's what nobody standing on a Ford lot in late 1956 was ever told. This is the last year. If you buy a Customline today, you are buying the final chapter of something that will never carry that name again. No dealer said it. No advertisement suggested it. The 1956 Customline was sold as though the name had a long future ahead of it, when the decision to retire it had already been signed off in Dearborn. There's something almost unsettling about that. Not because Ford did anything dishonest. Car companies restructure their lineups routinely. But because the people buying those cars in 1956 were unknowingly purchasing a closing chapter. They were buying history, while thinking they were buying the future. Pay attention to that, because that dynamic, the thing that feels current, becoming something historical, almost overnight, that's not unique to automobiles. It's one of the defining rhythms of modern life. But there's one more layer to this story, the deepest one, and it's less about Ford's boardroom and more about what this car actually represented in the life of the country. That's where we finish, and it hits differently than the sales figures do. Pull back far enough from the chrome and the engine specs and the sales charts, and you start to see something that doesn't fit neatly into an automotive history book. The Ford Customline across all four of its model years, from 1952 through 1956, was one of the last genuinely democratic cars built in America. And that word gets used loosely, so think about what it actually meant in practice. A school teacher in Ohio could buy a 1954 Customline four-door sedan. A foreman at a steel plant in Pennsylvania could buy the same car. A shop owner in Georgia. A postal worker in Minnesota. A junior accountant in Chicago. All of them with a reasonable amount of effort, with a manageable monthly payment, could drive the same car. Not a stripped-down approximation of the car, not a version of the car with the good things removed, the same car. And when they parked it on their street, nobody could read their bank account just by looking at what sat in the driveway. That kind of quiet equality built into a pricing structure without fanfare, without a press release, without anyone calling attention to it is rarer than most people realize. Rarer than. Almost non-existent now. The Customline years coincided with what economists call the Great Compression, roughly the late 1940s through the mid-1960s, the period when income inequality in the United States reached its historical low point, the broadest, most economically stable middle class the country had ever produced. You can debate the policies behind it, but the Customline is a physical artifact of that era. It drove those streets. It carried those families. It represents, in steel and glass and chrome, a specific moment in time that never quite returned in the same form. By 1957, even Ford's replacement lineup was beginning to stratify in ways that made the Customline's honesty look old-fashioned. The Fairlane 500 carried a price premium that priced out some Customline buyers entirely. The arms race had begun in earnest, and it never stopped. Today, a clean, original Ford Customline, particularly a 1954 or 1955 model, with honest original paint and a matching drivetrain, is becoming genuinely difficult to find in real condition. Not because they weren't built well, they were built honestly, and they lasted. But honest cars don't always get treated as precious until it's almost too late. They get used. They get modified. They get left in fields behind barns, while flashier machines get the garage space. The ones that survived deserve to be found. Not only as investments, though, the collector market for solid Customlines has been quietly rising, but as objects with genuine memory attached to them. Someone's grandfather drove one of these off a lot in 1953. He had saved for months. He walked around it 3 times in the showroom before he picked up the pen. He drove it home and parked in the driveway and stood at the kitchen window that evening, just looking at it. That's not nostalgia. That's history with a steering wheel. The Ford Customline lasted 4 model years. It sold in the millions. It carried a generation through some of the most consequential years in the country's story. And then it stepped aside quietly, as the decent ones often do, making room for something louder and flashier, and more interested in being seen. You now know more about this car than most people who claim to love it. If this is the kind of story you came here for, real history, told straight, without the gloss, then subscribe to this channel right now. Every week, we go deeper. Every week, we bring you the history that doesn't make it onto the museum placards. Drop a comment below. Tell me what the Customline means to you, whether you remember one from your childhood, whether someone in your family owned one, or whether you discovered it here today for the first time. Every comment matters, and I read them. And if there's someone in your life, a friend, a brother, someone who cares about this era the way you do, share this video with him. It's the simplest thing you can do for a channel like this. The Customline is gone, but now it lives a little longer here. We'll see you in the next one.